We now have 1 hour for our keynote panel this morning, and we have two outstanding practitioners from the banking system. Firstly, an ex-colleague of mine, Paul Achleitner, who is an alumni of St. Gallen and Harvard Business School. He started with Bain, then Goldman Sachs, became chairman of Goldman Sachs in Germany, and in 2000 he joined the management board of Allianz, taking responsibility for group finance. He sits on the board of a number of leading companies in Germany. He is also very involved with various government bodies, the Takeover Panel, the Corporate Governance Co, the Capital Markets Commission, and in addition to that, he's also not just a professor, but an honorary professor at the University of Koblenz. I take it that means you don't get paid. But secondly, somebody I've never met before, but read about and heard about a lot, Brady Dougan. Great to have you with us, Brady. Brady was educated at the University of Chicago, started in derivatives at Bankers Trust, then went to Credit Suisse First Boston, head of equities, head of securities, then CEO of Credit Suisse, and is at present the CEO of the Credit Suisse Group and of Credit Suisse itself. The subject is new boundaries for the financial industry between high expectations and grave concern. I'd like to ask Paul to come first, and then straight after that, Brady, and then we'll have a general Q&A. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. Dear students, I mean everybody in this room, because unless things have changed since I used to be here, then for the next 2.5 days, everybody in this room is a student. I'd say it's great to be here, and compliments to the organizers. As a footnote, I should add, when I was here, I never made it into the illustrious ranks of the organizing committee. And even my career as a driver was cut short by 3 tickets that the private car of the head of Mercedes Switzerland had to account for inexplicable reasons. Now, my job here is to tell you in 10 to 15 minutes what happened, and Brady's job is then what needs to be done. So I'm glad. That's what they told me, and I'm glad we're doing this in alphabetical order. So now, what happened? Now, in order to understand what happened, you don't have to be an alumnus of St. Gallen, but it helps. It helps because, at least when I used to be here, we read 2 authors who actually shed a lot of light of what happens. One is Hayek, who most of you are familiar with, and the other one is by a less well-known author, but the later dean of the Kennedy School of Government, called Graham Allison. Now, Hayek, to put this simple, described some systems as the consequence of human action, but not human design. And I think the shadow banking system that we're talking about is clearly one of those systems who were developed by human action, but there weren't a bunch of people sitting around a room and said, and this is how we're going to do it. The second thing, Graham Allison wrote a book called Essence of Decision, where he actually took the Cuban Missile Crisis and explained it by 3 different models of what happened. And each one of these models of why things happened the way that they happened was absolutely convincing in itself, but they had nothing to do with each other. So, and only one of them was the rational actor model, where, savvy Khrushchev was sitting over there saying, let me see what I can do with this young guy, Kennedy. And we tend to have a tendency of looking at most of the things with the rational actor model in mind, and that's not sufficient. So let me try to use those minutes to try to apply various different perspectives of what happened. Now, personally, I find it important to start with a perspective that might surprise you, and that is what I call my grandmother's perspective. When I have something complicated that I try to understand, I try to find out, is there a way that I condense what I think I have understood in a way that I can explain it to my grandmother and she will say, okay, I understand. Now here's my analogy of what happened. Think of our economy as a human body, and think of the financial system as the cardiovascular system of this human body. Now, let me suggest to you that for the last 20 years, what we have done is we have actually consumed performance-enhancing drugs, steroids, in the form of cheap capital, credit mostly. But those steroids allowed us to achieve things we would not have achieved otherwise. So this isn't just some abuse here on the side. The whole body was involved. The brain was also involved. But the cardiovascular system was weakened. And then, over the course of 2008, we saw, and maybe a little bit before that, we saw certain signs of high blood pressure and other good stuff, which were warning signs. But we didn't take that seriously enough. And then finally, in the fall of last year, we almost had a fatal heart attack. And that fatal heart attack of the cardiovascular system was prevented by surgical intervention by the governments. And only due to this surgical intervention, we're still alive. Now that we are alive doesn't mean that everything is well. We're in and out of the intensive care unit. At the very least, we're still being watched over. And we have one problem, and that is most people are standing around discussing that we would all be better off if we hadn't been eating these fatty foods in addition to the steroids, and would have been good if we'd done a little bit more sports, and then all of these things wouldn't have happened. Now that, frankly, doesn't help the patient. And the real issue and the real risk that I see is, given the fact that the only people standing around that bed who have some credibility left are the surgeons, we run a certain risk that the next thing that comes along is going to be plastic surgery, because the surgeons have figured out that the surgery stuff is actually fun in practice, and they might just keep on doing it. So that's my grandmother's perspective. Now, historic perspective. Let me submit to you that historically there have been many bubbles, as we have heard, but that these bubbles fall into two categories. Those that leave nothing behind, or avoid, like, for example, the Amsterdam tulip bubble or the Louisiana land boom, and those who actually live a legacy, as, for example, the private railroad expansion in North America, which wouldn't have been financed if these people wouldn't have gone crazy, or, more recently, the internet boom, because we wouldn't be having all these glass fiber cables and all the other good things around if people wouldn't have gone crazy during the internet boom, laying all these cables. And the internet today is more important to our society than it was in the year 2000, but there are just a lot fewer internet companies around. And those internet companies that are around need to have a decent business model in order to function, and can't say, just got 500 clicks, should be worth 200 million. And let me submit to you that the bubble that's currently bursting, or that has burst, as it relates to, let's call it the credit bubble, the leverage bubble, is one of those that leave a legacy. And the legacy is actually globalization and securitization. Because I would submit to you, in the old banking model, where the bank just took the credit on to their balance sheet and kept it there, globalization would have never been financed. Never to the degree that it has been developed and financed over the last 20 years. And we would all be poorer of it. So when we are all very scathing about what's currently going on, let's not forget there are some significant legacies, and let's be very careful that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, next perspective that you could employ, of course, is the macroeconomic perspective. And I make it easy for you, won't bother you with all this stuff, but at the end of the day, it's the phenomenon that some people call Chimerica, i.e. the symbiosis between China as a massive saver and exporter and America as a massive importer and debtor. And that system, per se, to the magnitude that it had been developed, wasn't going to be stable and holding up, is pretty clear in hindsight, even though people at the time were saying, don't worry about it, it's going to go on, it's going to go on, it's going to go on. And one of the reasons it went on, of course, was the Fed policy in terms of financing it. So from a macroeconomic point of view, it's pretty easy to see what's currently happening. Now, from a political point of view, let's not forget when we have all these people pointing fingers at the practitioners of the trade, let's not forget that a home for every American was an explicit policy by the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress, using, financing, encouraging, actually coercing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to go out there and lend at ever more lenient terms. Let us not forget for one moment, because it is something that's not going to go away and it's being exorbited by this situation, and that is, I'll get the lecture from you afterwards how I pronounce this correctly, Brian. Is that okay? Exacerbated was the word I was looking for. The demographic time bomb. Let me just 2 seconds on that. Given everybody's familiar what the issue is and the challenge. Now, there are only 3 ways you can deal with our demographic challenge. One is, we'll get more kids. Well, guess what? That's not going to work that fast. Second thing is, we're going to open up our boundaries so that our frontiers, so that there are more immigrants who are going to be paying for these increasing old age provisions. Or, thirdly, we have more capital accumulation and that capital returns more money. There aren't any other choices. And therefore, the question of capital accumulation and the return of that capital was also a societal desired action that politicians were also encouraging explicitly or implicitly. And it's something that's not going away. We'll have to deal with it going forward. Now, and then just a little aside, if you think about the UK and the London incentives to create a post-industrial center of global financial center where all kinds of tax incentives were used, lenient regulation was introduced, and other good things in order to promote that, it is pretty clear that there is a political perspective here of what has happened and why things have happened. This is a systemic perspective that you can apply. Basel II was mentioned before, the pro-cyclicality of Basel II, and there is something which I have been rather vocal about, not recently, but for the last 10 years, which is the mark-to-market fair value illusion, as I call it. I have always submitted that mark-to-market is a Marxist concept because Marx already knew all you had to have was a good term and then you had to be for it, like social justice. How can anybody be against social justice? Now, fair value accounting. How can anybody be against fair value? The discussion is dead. Now, if that makes any sense, is a different issue. And forget the discussion that's going on currently. Let me just, from the point of view of an insurance company, tell you the following. We invest money so that we can cover the liabilities that we have on the insurance side. The liabilities on the life insurance side run on average something like 20 years. My predecessors would put money away, for example, in equities, and if they have a situation like the current one, they would say, that's bad that the equity markets are where we are, but fortunately, we are long-term investors, and we're going to catch up over the long term. In today's world, I need to reduce that 20 years to quarterly reporting cycles, which are driving the regulatory requirements, and therefore the meaningful allocation to equities as an asset class is not possible, even though it makes no economic sense, but it makes all the sense from a regulatory and accounting point of view. Now, I don't want to be too long here, so I'll just give you, if you want to, refer to two other things on the side. One is a technological perspective, because obviously all of this stuff wouldn't have been possible if we wouldn't have information technology and securitization in the way that we actually have it. Now, the stuff that we don't know yet is what impact that has had on the behavioral side, because keep in mind, in the old days, people all had to digest information over some time. Today, they have it all on the same screen, and they do all act within minutes, if not to say seconds, which also exacerbates the behavior patterns and maybe not to the best. But let me focus on one last point, which I think is important from a behavioral point of view, because we're always missing that. This is not about bad guys in the financial services industry who just terribly misbehaved. Did that happen? Yes, it also happened. But there are two phenomena here that I think you need to keep in mind. One, something that I experienced also when I used to manage an investment bank, or part of that, is the relativity for young folk here. The issue is, I had countless 28 to 30-year-olds sitting on my couch telling me why the bonus was unfair and way too low. When I then had the conversation with the individual saying, look, did you ever think when you were studying that you would ever, leave alone at the tender age of 30, make as much money as you actually are making right now? The answer inevitably, at least with the honest ones, was no, absolutely not. Next thing was, do you deserve it? And the real answer was, on an absolute basis, no. But the real issue is, Jeff over there in New York, he's making 50 grand more than I am making, and I'm better than Jeff. And it is exactly that kind of dynamic that has led into the excesses that I think we have seen and have witnessed, and have caused many of the problems, with investment banks trying to compete with hedge funds, private equity industry, and so on and so forth. Now, some of that's going to change, and that's a good thing. I see Brian looking at me. 1 minute. 1 minute. Here's my personal theory, what also happened in big banks. It's called risk controlling versus risk management. In the old days, you used to have a risk controller. That means the guy who was out there in the front was responsible for risk and return, and the controller just checked if he was in line with the guidelines that were actually given. Then these risk controllers figured out that it's much sexier to be a risk manager, because somehow that way you get more money. And it sounds better. Now that meant that he was suddenly becoming the manager of that risk. That means that the guy in the front line who was responsible for return said, well, the risk part, that's not me anymore. That's this guy who gives me all this hard time, all this time anyway. So the risk manager sat there, and the risk manager, to prove that he's a tough risk manager, said, I come back as a return guy with 10 proposals. He shoots 7 of them down. Now, the 8th one, he figures out, I still got to do business with Achleitner, so it's okay. With the 8th one, you can go ahead, do it. If that's the better one than number 6, different issue. Now, the next thing, though, that happens is 2 other phenomena. First of all, I figure out that the risk manager is so busy putting all this stuff away that he has actually decided that AAA risks he isn't even going to look at. So smart guy as I am, I go out there and I find my friend over here who's going to give this AAA stamp out so that it doesn't even go via the risk manager, and I can do all this business. The second part that happens is I come to the risk manager and says, I don't like this risk. So my question is, do you not like this risk for the next year, 2 years, or 3 years? What's your concern? He says, well, in 2 years, I don't like the dynamics of this company. I say, don't worry about it. In 6 months, it's out the door. So let me do it for 6 months. He says, okay, thank you. Now, this all leads us to a very important question. What do we do about that? But unfortunately, I'm out of time, and I'll leave that to Brady.
That's not fair. I thought you did an excellent job, Paul. But I have to say, as to the first point you made, I don't know which is the harder task, actually. Whether actually trying to figure out what happened or what we need to do to fix it is harder. I think In business, certainly in our business, I've always felt that 80% of the effort goes into determining the facts. And once you have the facts, actually, people around the table will agree on what to do. But so much difficulty is around actually determining what the facts are. And I actually think that's one of our biggest issues in the current situation is there is far from a consensus about exactly what happened or how we got to where we are today. I actually think that description that Paul just gave is probably about the best description I've heard for the crisis so far. And I think also you laid out a few prescriptions for the future in there, which is helpful, some of which are consistent with what I would have to say. But I think I do think that is actually very important. There is still not, I think, a clear consensus on what has happened and how we got here. Recently, clearly, there's been more optimism in the markets. I think some of the green shoots are starting to look more like spring flowers. And the question is now, really, are we about to see a hard frost come back in, or maybe snow? Unsure. But I think it is important to note that the financial industry, I believe, is a leading indicator for the economy, for what's going on in the world. We were clearly the first industry to be impacted by the problems. In fact, many would say the primary cause of many of the problems. But I do believe that we will be the first industry to show signs of recovery. So the real economy will likely be shifted in terms of that scale. But the question about what's next is a critical one, and it's a real-time issue. The car is on the road. It's moving. Hopefully it's starting to regain some momentum at this point. We'll see. It's at least maybe not slowing down as quickly as it was. But we don't have the luxury of stopping now and pulling off to the side and taking time to figure out how we are going to take this forward. We really have to figure out in real time how we're going to move out of this crisis and how we're going to set a path towards a long-term sustainable future for the industry and for the economy around the world. So I think also we have to be very clear that there's no mistake about it. The prescription that we fill to solve these issues will have an impact on how we proceed. So I think actually 2009 is going to be a very critical year for the financial services industry and for the world economy, clearly. And it's a year when I think we have the opportunity to lay the foundations for prosperity for many years to come. But clearly there are going to be risks with that as well, as we do seek to rebuild the financial services industry and also look at the recovery of the global economy. So, I certainly don't have the crisp, complete solution or anything like it. I'm not sure anybody does. But what I thought I would do is raise a few questions or a few considerations that I think we do need to think about as we move forward. I think I break it down into a few key areas that I think are important, and some of them actually mirror some of Paul's comments. And they clearly interact as well. The first is really what I would call structural or systemic aspects, and I think that includes things like regulation, includes issues around industry structure. Secondly, and I completely agree with Paul on this, I think the behavioral aspects are too often overlooked. I think that this is a very important part of how we got here and a very important part of the prescription going forward. I sort of break that down into two major categories, or probably more, but one is around pro-cyclicality. The other is around the compensation issue. Again, those interact. And then the last category is around keeping perspective. On the regulation side, to start with, there will clearly be more regulation. There probably should be more regulation. Clearly, we've gotten to a current situation where a number of the business models and institutions needed support from governments around the world. As Paul mentioned, I don't think we'd be where we are today without that having happened. And even though I believe that in the long run it's better to have private ownership of banks, the government support has clearly been critical. But the issue now is developing the roadmap for how we exit those ownerships. And obviously we're starting to see that process unfold now in some parts of the world. What do we need with regulation, though? Well, I do think we need a consistent global regulatory playing field. And I think that assures that banks can operate effectively and can contribute as they need to the real economy without taking excessive risks. And I also think that both the industry particularly, but also industry and regulators together need to take a more global perspective and a more comprehensive perspective on the markets. I think we have to resist the urge to go back into plastic surgery mode, as Paul said. I think we have to resist the urge to assume that the right answer to everything is a new regulation. We need to preserve the ones that we have, which are good. We need to add new ones when we need to, but that's going to be a critical process. And I believe we have to have close cooperation between governments, regulatory authorities, and the companies in the industry. Coordination really across all those areas is absolutely vital to make sure that we end up with a sustainable model going forward for the industry and the world. Let me talk for a minute about business models, because I think that's an important issue. Obviously, not all the models have worked well over the past 18 months, which have been a very difficult period, but I think clearly some have proved very complex. And I think there's obviously been a lot of debate about this. I don't think that there is a single model which is the right model for the new competitive landscape in the future. In fact, we're starting to see, I would say for the first time, significant differentiation in business models. When you look at the first quarter results of a lot of the banks and a lot of the directions they're taking, there's real divergence in the business models that they're actually taking. But I do think there are going to be some common characteristics that do shape the banks that will continue to play going forward, and I think help to contribute to the recovery of the economy. I think there's no doubt that conservative funding is something that's been important, and it's something that will be important. That I think will partly be addressed through regulation on the liquidity side, but I also think that certain business models obviously have led to more conservative funding profiles, and I think that's something that will, I think, be very important for all financial institutions going forward. I think the wealth management side of the business, which is an important industry worldwide, will become, I think, more client-focused. I think actually right now is a time when all players, all customers of the financial services industry, as well as all the players in the financial service industry, are really reassessing how they do business, who they do business with. And this is creating challenges but also opportunities. I think clearly, though, capital strength is going to be very, very important. And I do believe that a global footprint is going to be important for that business model going forward. Investment banking obviously is a dramatically changing landscape now. We think there will be increased emphasis on client business. Certainly less complex products will be more in vogue. And I think in common with wealth management, we do think that a lot of the investment banking businesses will place a lot higher emphasis on the strength and stability of the counterparties and the banks that they're dealing with. So again, I think that the extremely well capitalized, often large global players are going to be very important players in that. Compensation models will clearly change as well. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute in the context of behavioral issues. But I do think that all of these trends will drive more focused business models. I do think that the balance between size and focus, though, is very important. People talk about the issues around big banks and, are banks too large to be successful? Are they too large to be risk managed? And I don't think it's really a question of size. I think it's a question of focus. I think you need to have a set of businesses which are narrow enough that you can drive a common culture and you can manage those businesses well. So it's not really a question of size, it's a question of breadth. And I think that's something that we'll see as we go forward, that models that are more focused, I think, will be better suited to the environment going forward. And I do think there'll be a lot more focus on the client side of things. I think Paul described some of the interactions, I think, quite well anecdotally. There's been a lot of emphasis on capital for the last decade in the financial services industry, and I think as a result of that, the client side of things really atrophied. And I think that the industry does a less good job today serving clients than it did 10 years ago, and that's something that I think needs to be redeveloped and something that I think will be very important going forward. So I think, again, looking at our business at Credit Suisse, we've obviously tried to put a number of these things into place, and I think we believe that is a very important direction going forward. One of the other things that I think is important, and it's both a business model issue and a business issue as well as a behavioral issue, is the issue of pro-cyclicality. And one of the things that we've looked at Credit Suisse, and our former chairman, Mr. Kielholz, is in the audience here. He and I spent a lot of time talking about the issue of pro-cyclicality, in that it's really one of the most fundamental issues of human nature. And it's one of the things that I think contributed very strongly to how we got to the point that we're at today. It's very hard and counter to human nature to have the courage to buck the trend. And there's a lot of, particularly in the financial services industry, there's a lot of competitive pressure. And there's always the issue of, well, why aren't you in that business? They seem to be doing well. Why aren't you doing more in that business? And we've all sat in meetings with, where those kinds of discussions have taken place. And what's going to be important is being able to exercise discipline on that point. And I'm not sure there's an easy prescription for that, but I think it is a very important aspect of the way that we structure our business and manage them. And it does lead into the behavior aspects. I think it is probably the most difficult thing to manage with people and with organizations is that pro-cyclicality issue. And it's a very difficult thing to break, but it's something that we're going to have to work, I think, hard to make efforts to do. Talking about compensation quickly, clearly compensation is an important part of our business models. It's also a contributor to how we got to where we are today. As I mentioned, there's not a consensus about the factors that contributed to how we got here today. There's probably even less consensus around how to weight those factors. And a lot of people would look at compensation as being a very big part of how we got into the situation we're in. I think it's a contributor, but I think that certainly it's only one of many contributors to the overall issues. But clearly compensation is a key tool to influence behavior, for managing business, for providing incentives, retaining people, rewarding employees. And I think that's particularly important in industries like ours, where there's a significantly more capital on the human capital side than there is in physical capital. And so, it's something that is very critical to how we manage the business properly. Compensation models have become very complex, there's no question, over the years. And I think a lot of that's been well intended in terms of trying to come up with systems which are well structured. But I do think that we will be able to make some progress on continuing to adapt those systems and getting into a better situation on the compensation side. I think incentivization and alignment will continue to be very important. But some of the things that I think we were missing in the past, which is more of a risk-adjusted point of view on compensation and more of a long-term view on compensation, are probably things that we will be able to adjust in the compensation structure. We thought that, for instance, at Credit Suisse, we think that we actually have done a pretty good job over the past years in structuring the system. Clearly, people, our senior management group, for instance, lost about 80% of the value they had in the companies and company instruments in the last year. That clearly shows a lot of alignment. So we've tried to be responsive to that. But clearly, I think there is more that we can do on the compensation side. So I think that's something that will be important and where we will be able to make improvements. The third category and the last category was really this issue of perspective. And I think Paul mentioned a little bit, but I think it's very, very important that we keep in perspective that, I hear people say, well, we have to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And I think the important question is, what is this? Because we had probably 25 years of some of the most outstanding development and creation of prosperity around the world as a result of the financial systems that we've had. And I think that has to be kept in perspective. We can't take steps that weaken the system that has actually allowed us to build that over time. But clearly, we have to improve on what we have. It's the last couple of years clearly have shown that there are dramatic improvements that we need to make. But we have to try to keep what we have in order to make sure that we can create a road to a sustainable future for the world economy and the financial system. So I think those are some of the key issues that we need to think about as we develop a path forward. I do think right now we have a huge responsibility and a huge opportunity. Getting the next steps right can lead to both short-term improvements but also lay the groundwork for prosperity for the world for many years to come. And I think to do that, we do need to continue to analyze what happened, how we got here. I think that is a big part of understanding what we need to do to fix that. But clearly, we need to make sure that we preserve some of the good aspects of what we have, but also to make the amendments and the changes that we need to drive the business forward. And I think it's very important that we realize that banks don't operate in isolation. I mean, that was obvious before the crisis. I think it's become far more obvious over the past couple of years. I think that the whole industry needs to think beyond their traditional boundaries of how they run their business. We're managers of risk, liquidity, asset flows, no doubt, but we're also very important players in global society. We have a responsibility to look beyond just bottom lines and to contribute to the recovery of the global financial system and the global economy as a whole, and I think a commitment to really make sure that we're working towards progress for all of our stakeholders. So I think if we keep those principles in mind, I think we'll be able to come out of this with a much stronger path in the future towards much more sustainable growth. So with that, happy to turn it back over. Thank you.
Could I ask once again if we could just have the lights turned up, please? Can I thank both speakers? They were very to-the-point presentations, and I'd now like to open it up to questions. Lady there with her hand up. Can I have another hand? The gentleman there as number 2.
Thank you. My name is Elena Kvochko. I come from Russia. So my question is the following. It seems that after the bubble burst, we tend to find the ones who are to blame for it. And Dr. Achleitner also mentioned the problem of finger pointing. So now the responsibility to a great extent is laid on the rating agencies. And I was wondering, do businesses still rely on the rating agencies? Is it still an authoritative source of risk assessment? Or do you think there's anything that can replace them now? Thank you.
Paul, why don't you start with Brady? I'd also like to ask you to come in.
First of all, as I said before, many factors and many actors have contributed, and I think single cause explanations don't work at all. Now, I have an easy job here because I can tell you that our asset management company, PIMCO, has never relied on rating agencies and has always prided itself to have their own singular risk assessment and credit analysis capability, and they have fared reasonably well. Now, that's easy to say if you got a gigantic machinery behind you that can actually afford to do that. It is not a solution, obviously, for everybody out there, and therefore it means that there will need to be rating agencies going forward. There is need for those services. There's no question about that. I think the way that those services are being handled, paid for, all that needs to be rethought. And the other thing which has already been achieved is that people who are the recipients of that advice won't take that as the Bible or the Quran or whatever, okay? They will challenge what's in there and they will think about it.
Brady.
I would agree with all that. I would simply say also that I think that the task that we set for the rating agencies was a very difficult one, if not impossible. And so I think we need to think about actually what we're asking them to do and how that information is being used. So, to create for extremely complex securities and to expect to boil that down to a couple of letters and then have someone understand the complexity of that kind of an instrument, I think is just not possible. And so, there's a question of whether, how that should actually be done, what kind of information should be imparted, I think is an important one. But I do believe it is an essential. Having sort of common utilities that do that, I think, is essential for the functioning of the financial markets.
Gentleman there.
My name is Greg Shinsky. I'm from Australia. In the context of having fundamental changes to the system, what does the panel, what role do you think moral hazard plays in policy reform in the future?
Excellent question again. Paul?
Can I have an easier one? Look, I think the issue of moral hazard is one that is intellectually quite stimulating and quite interesting. But it is not as practically relevant as people think. Because I do not believe that individuals are genuinely out there saying, I'm going to do something, but I think it's going to blow up, but it's not going to impact me. I'm not excluding that some individuals are around. But I think we're being totally unfair to institutions and individuals to thoroughly believe that a majority of them, or even those people who can influence you, function like that. Because let me just use a simple example. Those executives who have been in many of the leading financial institutions, who have fallen, if I may call it that, victim to the last events of the last 2 years. Do you think that they have actually done what they have done because they thought, I'm going to make a little bit more money, and if it blows up, it blows up? That's not how people like that really function. Most of them have enough of that money away anyway, and they have other things that matter to them. And therefore, I think while moral hazard is an intellectually interesting concept and is something we shouldn't be totally ignoring, I think it can also be overplayed.
Paul, can I just challenge you on that? We heard a quote earlier from Alan Meltzer, if banks are too big to fail, they're too big. I mean, what about that issue?
Well, I think that raises a totally different issue. I don't think it's a question of size. I think it's a question of the type of risks banks that are too big to fail, are going to be allowed to have. Let me just say this. If you would have a concept about banks being too big to fail, I'm not sure Lehman wouldn't have been that high up on the list. And as a matter of fact, I think Hank Paulson and others de facto thought in order to avoid the issue of moral hazard, they actually had to have an example, and they decided it's going to be one of the littler ones and smaller ones, and so what? Lehman Brothers goes in order to avoid moral hazard. Now look at where that got us to. So I don't think this is a question of designing what the appropriate size is. I think it is a question of designing what kind of risks you're allowed to be taking, as somebody who is regulated.
Brady.
Yeah, I would agree with most of those comments. I think moral hazard to me is a sort of politically charged buzzword. I think that the concept around it is an important concept, and when we talk about behavioral elements, we have to address that. We have to make sure that there are consequences and accountability, and that's factored into how people work. But it's moral hazard is, I think, taken on a different sort of meaning in the media and in general. But I do think the concept is something that we clearly have to think about as we design behavioral systems. On the size issue, I think it is possible to, I don't think that there is a size issue per se. Banks can and have been, even through the last 2 years, they've been stress tested through some very, very difficult periods. They can be managed successfully through a period like that. So the size has not been the issue. There have been issues around different activities and all the things that we talked about in terms of how we got here. But I don't think size in and of itself is the issue.
Gentlemen, yes.
Hi, I'm Wang Fan from National University of Singapore. Actually, it's not a question, but rather an argument. I'm going to do...
We must keep it short. Is that all right?
But it's kind of like a question as well. Okay, I'm going to pursue Master of Financial Engineering next year. So unlike many of the speakers today and President Obama, I have a biased opinion on financial innovation. So I think those mathematical models only reduce the risk. We cannot blame a better engine for more road accident. So it's just a tool. So I think we should focus more on, from macro level, the regulations, and micro level on the compensation and organization structure of individual banks. to channel those advanced models for better use. So I don't think we should totally say, it's because of these technical details people don't understand that caused the financial crisis. And I would like to know what's your view on that.
Yeah. Brady.
I agree. I agree. No, I think actually the point you raise about innovation is a very important point, which is that I think I'm a big believer in innovation, and innovation obviously creates wealth, creates prosperity. But I think innovation got down the wrong track over the past period of time. And in fact, I think what's critical is that innovation is client-focused, that it's client need-focused, as opposed to where you get into trouble is when you have a group of financial engineers sitting in a closet somewhere and dreaming up something that looks pretty interesting but doesn't necessarily suit or solve a particular problem. So innovation is great, needs to be more client-driven, more client-originated. But it's the lifeblood of the business. I mean, the financial services industry recreates itself completely every 20 years. Every 20 years, I think probably 90% of the revenues that are made by banks today didn't even exist 25 years ago. So it's a constant recreation, but it's got to be done in a responsible and properly focused way, which in my view means the client side of it needs to dominate.
Let me actually use your analogy. As an insurance guy, I can tell you, yes, there are some technical innovations in cars that lead to more road accidents. Because people think that they don't have to pay attention anymore because the machine is doing it for them. So if you are not, the prescription for that obviously is not to have the innovations. Okay, the prescription is that you still learn how to drive properly, and that I think is the critical element here. And just to also say something to the relief of the regulators as well as the bankers. There's a lot of excitement out there that says these people shouldn't be in their jobs because they don't even understand those models. Okay, now you tell me how many of the car executives actually understand exactly how the electronics in their cars work. Most mechanics don't know how they work; they just replace them. But most car executives do know how a car functions in general, even though they use these little models and black boxes. And I think that's what we just need to remember as we go forward.
There's a lady here who I'm going to ask, but can I just ask a question my own first? I sit on a commission in the House of Lords, a select committee, which we're looking into the subject of banking supervision and regulation. And one issue which comes up time and again is the question of governance, particularly the role of non-executive or independent directors. And I just wonder because, for example, people say, we had the Royal Bank of Scotland, HBOS, we had very talented people, very senior business people, but who knew nothing about the mathematical models that were being used and so on. Going forward, what kind of, how would you structure the governance of financial institutions?
Well, I actually think that is a very important point. I think that having strong governance, and particularly an independent, well-qualified board, is very, very important. And I actually think that one of the big advantages that Credit Suisse had over the past 2 years is having exactly that, which is a very well-led, strong board with the right mix of capabilities there, as you say, including not everybody has to be a financial expert, and we need to have people with perspectives that are outside the industry, but you need to have people who also have that perspective, and I think that's something that's very, very important. So I think things like independent chairman and CEO, combining those titles, I think is not the best way to go forward. I think you get better corporate governance without that. And I think that's a critical issue. So I think that is something that we need to address going forward.
Brian, I must say I think it's a terrible question because Brady could only answer it the way he answered it, given that Walter Kielholz is sitting here in the room. And I can't answer it because I don't want to forgo my chances to end up on one of those boards. So.
If I can just say something following on from Brady. Brady, I think much as Sarbanes-Oxley introduced a requirement that so many people on a board should have financial knowledge and so on, I think we're getting to the point where on a bank board, if they undertake investment banking activities, there should be some people who really understand risk. You know, not many, maybe just 2 or 3, but enough to chair the Audit Compliance Business Practice Committee.
I think there should be a substantial group that understand that, but I also do think that there is value to having people with other perspectives, outside the industry. But I agree with you. You need to have a critical mass of people who do clearly have a good understanding of the business. Very important.
That was in default of Paul.
Thank you.
Couldn't have said it better.
I should say, by the way, I don't think probably people know, but the reason I first came to St. Gallen, the reason I was asked to debate with Joschka Fischer, who was then the Foreign Minister of Germany, was because of Paul Achleitner. So the reason I'm here is because of him.
Hello, I'm Lisa Herzog. I'm from Germany, and I'll actually pick up on exactly the topic that has been talked about right now, which is the question of diversity. And I'd like you to comment on whether you think that more diversity in the banking sector could actually help avoiding those behavioral effects that we have seen in the past. I mean, I'm a credit student, and we are being targeted by those companies to be their employees. And you know exactly what kind of people are going to respond to those ads and those flyers and those events that you get there. So I was wondering whether the recruiting process of the financial industry should change and put more focus on minorities, maybe women, whatever, get more diversity in there. Thank you.
Paul, why didn't you start on this one?
Let me just say this. I think you're wrong. I think you do not find more diverse universes, and companies than financial institutions, or let me be precise, than investment banks. Okay? From what I can tell, investment banks have always looked, at people, their performance. I have, in my own experience of 12 years at Goldman Sachs, worked with people from all walks of life. And I have worked for women. Has never been an issue as it is maybe in some industrial companies and other good things. So therefore, I think the type of recruiting that investment banks are actually undertaking is very much focused on picking the best and not, kind of like looking for quotas or for the same kind of individuals and so on and so forth. So if we need to improve, so therefore, but the other side of the coin is, I don't think a lack of diversity is to blame for where we are in this type of thing. That's not the issue.
Brady.
Well, not to. I mean, we'd like to have more diversity, and I think I personally completely agree with your point that I think we would have. I think we've been better off over the last 2 years if we'd had more diversity and more women in senior management positions. So we'd like to have that. The question is, how can we make that happen? So maybe you can help us by joining Credit Suisse. But seriously, I actually think we would love to have more diversity, because I think it is. Diversity of thinking and approach is incredibly important, and it leads to better decision making, and there's all sorts of theory behind that, as you know, but I absolutely believe it. Absolutely.